Hi, this is Peter Schweizer, and welcome to the Drill Down. Well, it's big, fat, and out of control. And I'm not talking about your typical congressman, and I'm not talking about your typical career bureaucrat. I'm talking about the Pentagon, and they are going to be in the crosshairs of DOGE, and we're going to dissect it for you today. And wait until you hear what they've been putting on their credit cards. The co-host of this program, of course, is Eric Eggers. Eric, how are you? By the way, do you have a company credit card?
How come at the beginning of each podcast, you increasingly sound like you work for the IRS? Like last week, you asked me if I was familiar with money laundering. Now you're asking about company credit cards.
I have my suspicions.
This is after you've needlessly body-shamed bureaucrats and members of Congress. Peter Schweizer woke up today and chose violence, America. So, no, it is really interesting, and we will talk about, I think military spending and waste. And by the way, just the fact that we have had this acknowledgement that that military spending is actually going to be examined, I think, in a very real way, has given me hope for a different problem facing America. But it does speak to how effective the Trump administration and Elon Musk has been about changing the conversation, that we have this in a very real way. But I do think that we should just pause for a moment, and you need to just say thank you, Peter Schweizer. Have you said thank you one time to the members of the military? You're over here attacking them. The power dynamic, say thank you. Because after all, just like Donald Trump in his conversation with Zelensky, the military is holding all the cards.
They are holding the cards. They're holding a lot of credit cards. And we're going to dissect what they've been spending large sums of money on those credit cards. Hint, hint, strip clubs, casinos, etc. We're going to go through those details. But let's step back for a minute and look at the enormity of this moment, because I think you're exactly right. We are looking at Pentagon waste. We are looking at absolute reform. And it's going to take somebody like Donald Trump, who loves the military, who's pro-military, to do it. Because the problem, I think, for a lot of people that are, on the right side of the political spectrum, they view the Pentagon the way that liberals view the Department of Education, which is the more spending, the more you're going to get. And the problem is that in the military, there's a lot of fat, there's a lot of waste. And I think one of the things that the new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, is focused on is war fighting, because we'll talk about this later, the tooth and the tail of the military. The tooth is the actual war fighting capability. The tail is everything that goes on the back end. The tail has grown enormously at the expense of the tooth. So we're going to get to that. But first of all, let's talk about something very minor, but I think emblematic of the problem. It's minor in terms of the amounts of money, and that's the credit card problem, right? The Pentagon issues credit cards to civilian employees and some military personnel, and they've had a recurring problem. Tell us about the recurring problem and how they don't seem capable of just putting in a basic feature to prevent the misuse of these credit cards.
So one of our researchers came across this Inspector General report from the Department of Defense, which just came out at the end of January, and we were kind of shocked that it didn't get picked up more. So, but we will tell you what they found. But first, a bit of context. So the military has had, and the Pentagon has had, a credit card spending problem for some time. So they did an audit back 10 years ago in 2015, and they found that we're not naming names here, but some Department of Defense personnel were improperly using these credit cards for personal use at, among other places, casinos and adult entertainment establishments. Maybe they were doing research for Oscar-winning films in the future. Who knows? But the report found that there was 4,000 transactions at ATMs outside of strip clubs and casinos for $1 million.
Right.
And so
why would you need cash, for example, at a strip club? Couldn't you just use a card?
So I'm proud to say that is a question I do not know the answer to.
Well, I've seen enough movies. I think I know why they need the cash. So they're literally, they know that they were done at these establishments, these cards.
Yeah.
And we're talking about, what, thousands of transactions, you said?
Yeah, 900 transactions from July of 2013 to end of June 2014 for $100,000 at adult entertainment establishments and 4,000 transactions outside of casinos. And so what they did is they said, hey, this is not okay.
Right.
So they set up this system, a monitoring software essentially, where they're going to start putting into, like, they're going to start, hey, these are the places we know you shouldn't be using your credit card to try to flag it.
So they solved the problem.
Not exactly. That's sort of what the the new report has found, it said so few officials used this Visa government travel charge card oversight system that it allowed 4 million card transactions worth $1.2 billion that couldn't be reviewed in detail because they didn't use the software system that they set up because of the last audit.
So give those numbers again. So we went from like a few thousand transactions 2015 to today these numbers.
Yeah.
And that they don't even know where that money was spent.
Yeah, they tried to. They should have been flagged based on protocols they tried to set up a decade ago, and they were not. And what the Inspector General found is that they could have added more places that they should have been automatically then flagged. Like, hey, this looks like it's an ATM outside of a casino or an outside of a adult entertainment facility. Like, this is not what we gave you these credit cards to do, soldier, or software engineer, or whoever it is. And so, so it turns out the trends continue. They found out at least 11,000 transactions, over $500,000 recently made at casino ATMs or bars or nightclubs. And it turns out that there's a bit of a trend that happens because they flagged on holidays. I guess the credit card spending gets especially festive outside the Super Bowl, outside the UFC fights, and Cinco de Mayo, among others. So they found over $100,000 worth of transactions that should have been prevented or flagged as possibly fraudulent or instances of abuse because this monitoring system they created wasn't used.
Right. And so this is an example. People are going to say, oh, the amounts of money is so small. The Pentagon budget's, $900 billion. But it's emblematic of the larger problem, right? It has been reported accurately that the Pentagon has not faced or passed an audit in who knows how many years. So this is emblematic of the problem. You keep shoveling more money at the Department of Defense. It's not going to necessarily end up with the warfighters, or at least in an official capacity for the warfighters. And nobody's really keeping track of how the money's being spent. So this is a small blip in the problem, but emblematic of the larger issue, which is they are not accounting. The Pentagon, although it is made up of military personnel who serve this country nobly, it is a government agency that's ultimately run by bureaucrats who are not going to take care of taxpayer money the way that they would their own.
And from a transparency standpoint, it's a black box.
Yeah.
And it's a very expensive black box. So since the 90s, every federal agency has been subject to audits, except for the Pentagon. They didn't conduct one until 2018. And now, because there has been some oversight, I mean, this is a massive, massive deal. $850 billion proposed budget. That's the second highest among cabinet level agencies. And we talk a lot about incentives. If you're one of the subcontractors or you're anybody receiving any of that money, you have very, very little incentive to see that the spending gets reviewed because you're currently receiving quite a lot of it. And so in 2024, Open the Books, our friends at Open the Books Foundation, they did an audit, and they found that 68% of Pentagon agencies failed or were issued disclaimers. So they kind of fell substandard in terms of their bookkeeping practices. That, by the way, is a problem throughout the military. Like, this thing is so big, they literally don't know where the money's going and what they're spending it on.
Yeah, and so the solution here is not to say, well, we need to continue to add to the budget, because we don't know that it's going to be used, and we know it's not going to be used effectively. So part of what we want DOGE to do, and I think they're preparing to do, is look at the books in the way that they have looked at these other government agencies, looked at the contracts, look at the credit card transactions. There's another part of the problem that I think they need to address, and that is this issue of how they have built up, the bureaucracy has built up constituencies within themselves that are resistant to change and won't advocate for the betterment of the organization. I'll give you an example of what I mean. So Pete Hegseth came in. One of the first things he did was he said, I'm going to remove the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and replace him, and I'm going to remove some other flag officers. And a lot of people said, okay, this is about DEI. But I think it's also about a larger cultural problem, and that is the rise of the bureaucracy in the Pentagon. And so these are some numbers we came up. I think it's quite astonishing. Think of the numbers of admirals and generals that we have in the United States. And of course, admirals and generals are important because they lead the military, but they're also the officers that are going to be most resistant to change, right? They were the last ones who wanted to use tanks in World War I. They were the last ones that wanted to make use of aircraft and other advances in technology. They're resistant to change. Think of the numbers of the growth in admirals and generals that we've had in the United States. During World War II, we had one admiral or general for 6,000 enlisted personnel. Today, that number is one admiral or general to 1,400.
Now, those numbers, I think, belie the dramatic shift, because your point would be, it's like, okay, 1 to 6,000 versus 1 to 1,400. But your point is, how many soldiers did we have in World War II?
Yeah, and here's an even more stark number. Exactly. We had 13 million soldiers and Marines and Navy personnel and aviators in World War II. For those 12 million, in World War II, we had 22 four-star admirals or generals. 22 four-stars admirals and generals. Today, we have 39 to 44 four-star admirals and generals, and our military is about 10% that size. We have 1.3 million enlisted personnel. So my point is, we become top heavy with these admirals and generals that are resistant to change, and they love their weapon systems. They love their fighter aircraft. That's what they trained on. That's what they know. They want more of those. They love their aircraft carriers because that's what they trained on. That's what they know. So they're resistant and they're bloated to change. And so this is something else that DOGE has to look at, how the military's become so top heavy with these flag officers.
And as they become more top heavy and therefore more expensive, unfortunately we become like far less effective. And that's just the reality of where things are. So a couple of stats on this. By the way, you mentioned aircraft carriers. I was shocked to learn how expensive those are.
How much does an aircraft carrier cost?
They're saying some of these aircraft carriers, in the Gerald Ford fleet, are like $13 billion a piece.
With a B.
With a B.
Wow.
That's an expensive boat.
That is a very
I know they're
expensive
doing
boat.
a lot, but
Yeah, and look, you can say aircraft carriers are good, but for that cost, and somebody could potentially use a missile to damage that or destroy that aircraft carrier, that's a scary scenario.
So just to kind of go back to the stats you're making, because I think it's a very important deal. This speaks to like the culture of the military. So we have gotten away from the focus on the warfighters, and the focus is now on everything besides the warfighters. So you have way more administration. In World War II, you're the one that told me this, a four-star officer commanded but somewhere like 1 million troops.
Yeah.
And now a four-star officer commands like 30,000 troops. So they're far less focused on actual, like, putting people in the battlefield in right places. And they're taking meetings, and they're figuring out, like, what should we buy, and all that kind of stuff. And they're managing contractors. Listen to this, because, and I attended a screening of a film about the Afghanistan withdrawal and all the culture of the military and how it led to some of the failures in Afghanistan. And I think you could make the argument this is a big part of the RNC with Donald Trump, and that's when Joe Biden was still in the race. And all the neutral commentators like, oh my gosh, that's damning. The way he just prosecuted and held Joe Biden responsible for the failure in Afghanistan. But listen to this. The Department of Defense has 2 million employees. So they're the largest employer in the world. When Kabul fell to the Taliban, we had 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. We ceded. Now, that was part of the plan, but the point is we lost 13 American lives. Yeah. It did not go well, and we only had 2,500 troops in place in Afghanistan at the time.
Yeah.
But we had 18,000 contractors in Afghanistan working on logistics. That just speaks to, again, the allocation of resources and the shift in priority.
And by the way, to your point, it would be interesting to know, I would imagine the figure's pretty high, how many of those contracting firms are headed by retired military officers, right? I mean, so in other words, you create this sort of potential revolving door scenario where a guy can leave the military, set up a firm with some buddies, and make good money being a contractor. It creates incentive structures in the officer class that don't necessarily serve the interests of America's military mission.
I didn't know that this thing exists, but you're the one that told me about something called the tooth-to-tail ratio. It sounds like something that happens to old people, but
it does. I turned 60. It does.
But what is the tooth-to-tail ratio?
Well, the teeth are, of course, what you are biting and destroying the enemy with. And that's really what the military is supposed to do, right?
Yeah.
Kill people and destroy things. That's its major role. The tail, and of course, you need to have some of this. You need logistics. You need ammunition supplies getting to your fighters. But the tail is the rest of it, the back end.
So we used to have a far greater tooth ratio back when we were in the business of fighting actual wars. So in World War I, 28% of our military personnel were soldiers. World War II is 19%. Gulf War, 17%. What do all those have in common? Those are all conflicts the United States considers to have won.
Yeah.
But we have struggled to win with less combat power. 7.5% tooth-to-tail ratio in Korea, 7% in Vietnam. In the most recent Iraq war, 11%. So the tail has gotten bigger, and there's to your point about incentives, there's more money there than the actual tooth. And as you pointed out, this comes at a time when we are struggling to recruit people for active duty.
Yeah, and think about it. Who has the biggest voice in Pentagon policy? It depends who the leadership is. And that's why I think Pete Hegseth was a great choice for Secretary of Defense. He was a war fighter, and he's come in and said, this is my constituency in the military. Doesn't look like Hegseth wants to go work for Raytheon when he's done. So he is
I wouldn't rule it out.
He is focused, I think, on the precise area where he needs to be focused, and you're going to get a lot of griping from who? From those 4-star officers, from other senior officers that are part of the tail, that are part of the established culture. They liked the cozy relationships that existed before. They don't like this change in turbulence and turmoil, and they're going to wrap their criticism in national security terms. It's just like locally. We've had this here. You've had it other places. When people say they don't want to raise local property taxes, what does the county or city council do? They immediately start talking about cutting the fire department, not cutting the bureaucrats. It's the same kind of mindset, and we need to say no. We're going to focus on the war fighters. We're not going to focus on all this other crap at the tail end where you guys have been making so much money.
In fairness, they also here where we live talk about cutting mosquito control, which I would argue is as important in some cases.
Right.
But to the point about how big the tail has gotten, and I think Pete Hegseth deserves a lot of credit because he has said he welcomes Elon Musk, he welcomes the oversight, because the tail is so big, they literally don't know where all the scales are, if you want to continue the metaphor. Right. The Department of Defense has $4.1 trillion in assets.
Wow.
So that's buildings, cash, investments. That's 72% of all government assets, according to an audit from last year. And in that same audit, they said they found snafus everywhere. So there's 21 different ways the Army lost control of its $20 billion worth of inventory, including a failure to even choose anyone to keep an eye on it. So
that's not a good strategy.
That's not a good strategy. And so, in 2023, the Department of Defense had a treasury balance of $768 billion that they were allowed to spend, but many agencies said they couldn't say where the money they'd already spent had gone. The Special Operations Command had a $34 billion difference between its own spending records and the Treasury. So just think about that. Yeah. $34 billion, they're like, well, no, we think it went there. And Treasury's like, well, we don't have a record of that.
Yeah.
And so when you see examples of things like the $10,000 soap dispenser or the $100,000 toilet, which are real things that have been reported on, those happen because they just get thrown into the mix and they get reported even by Inspector General reports with language like, the Air Force did not consistently pay reasonable prices for quarter of the spare parts, which includes the $10,000 soap dispenser. So, I mean, it's a massive, massive deal. And I think the fact that DOGE will begin to go there, I mean, it is people's livelihoods. It is very expensive contracts. But I do think that the Trump administration deserves credit for at least initially having a posture of saying, no, we welcome this.
Yeah. You got to look under every rock. And by the way, let's think about accountability, okay? In the military, this is one of the things that Pete Hegseth talked about when he was appointed. You have these situations where American military personnel in Iraq and elsewhere had to make really difficult decisions in a war situation where they were fighting. And sometimes they were charged with, war crimes or other violations of the Uniform Code of Conduct. What about actually holding these guys into account that are missing millions or billions of dollars. You're not trying to make a life or death decision because somebody's shooting at you. It's an office bureaucratic decision, and you're making the wrong decision, and it's costing lots of money. So how about actually going after bureaucrats and people that are not doing their job on the tail rather than just focusing on the people that are on the teeth? And the other thing I would say is they need to overhaul this cost plus contracting approach that they take at the military, which is basically, give us the cost of the unit plus your coverage on the top. So, what does that do? That incentivizes these big military contractors to raise the cost of the price because their cut off the top is a percentage of that. So you want it to be bigger. You want it to be larger. It's like a real estate agent. They want to sell a house for the largest price they can because they get a percentage of the proceeds. The same kind of incentive exists here. That's totally the wrong way to do contracting, and they need to start applying some private sector approaches that corporations would take. Say, look, you promised to deliver us these aircraft for this price. We're going to hold that to you, or we're going to sue you.
Well, what that accountability looks like so far with the private sector is, so Lockheed, for example, they have the contract to make this F-35 fighter jet, which, if you haven't heard, it's not going well. So Lockheed had to pay $30 million as part of a lawsuit because it was accused of ripping off the Pentagon for years. But the F-35 is going to cost taxpayers, $30 million fine for Lockheed. It's not nothing.
Right.
But the F-35 is supposed to cost over $2 trillion over the course of its life cycle. So, it just speaks to how much is the fine versus how much have the cost pluses been. Yeah. And those are among the things that we're going to hear from. Now, it gets a little tricky within the Defense Department because among the contractors for the Defense Department are SpaceX and Tesla, which Elon Musk happens to own. So how much do we expect there to be a razor-sharp level of incisiveness in cutting out waste if he's one of the companies who might benefit from that laissez-faire approach to contracting?
Yeah, and we need to watch that. Here's the thing. We've said that. We like what Elon Musk is doing, but we also know that human beings sometimes shave things if it's to their benefit. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but we're going to monitor it because they need to look at everything. They need to lift up the hood and look at everything and hold them into account. So I'm thrilled that this is happening. I think it's very exciting. Realize we're going to hear a lot of turmoil. You're going to see a lot of retired military officers going on cable TV saying, oh, this is very disruptive. It's going to damage national security. No, it's not. It's going to enhance national security. And you're saying that because you were part of that old crony system.
I will say this, the fact that they're even willing to tackle it, and we'll see how it does, right?
Yeah.
This could be another Epstein file situation where there's a lot of talk initially, and maybe it's
we started with the strippers and the casinos, and we're now at the Epstein files.
Maybe that's actually where the other Epstein files are. They're with the other $20 billion in assets that the military has lost. Like, dang it, it's all in this one box somewhere in the Southern District of New York. We don't know where a lot of stuff is right now in the government. But I will say, if they're able to do a job on this, then what it actually makes me think about and gives me hope for is something that I, spent time researching, and it's not Defense Department related, but it is related to, I think, our sovereignty, and that is our voter files. And so, to me, the biggest thing that continues to threaten the integrity of American elections is the inaccuracy in the voting databases. And it just made me think, man, what if the approach they're taking, if they're getting good at analyzing data and looking at this in a real way, and it's like, you know what, that shouldn't be there, and they're willing to have courageous conversations and willing to take whatever criticism comes from just saying the right thing. If they can apply that same approach to the voter files, I think we know voter integrity and election integrity is a big deal to Donald Trump. I think my prediction is I think you'll see the same tool and the same approach be used there at some point over the next 4 years.
Well, let's hope so. The challenge, of course, is the voter rolls are held by state and local governments. And so I'm not sure the state of California wants Elon Musk going up and cleaning up the voter rolls. But to your point, absolutely, we need to help, lead in that direction.
But if Donald Trump has proved, look, if he's willing to threaten tariffs on Canada to get him to stop doing, no, seriously, to stop doing fentanyl stuff, I think that you'll find he's willing to use lots of different leverage to get creative solutions to the outcome he wants to see achieved. So I'm just saying that's something to pay attention to. It's what I thought about as I was looking at this data analysis.
No, I think that's a great point. So thank you as always for listening to this podcast. We're going to continue to follow this story as it unfolds. We are excited, but we are also cautiously optimistic. And we'll let you know what we discover and what we uncover as this process goes forward. You can look at our research and learn out more about our work at thedrilldown.com. And of course, you can subscribe to this podcast wherever wonderful podcasts are located. Until next time, thank you very much.